200 years ago, Britain's Royal Navy was the most technologically advanced and supremely efficient force in the history of naval warfare.
But what was it like to live and work on board these ships? What did the men eat? How did the ships sail? And what were the weapons they used?
Whoa! This is the story not of Lord Nelson and the other admirals that commanded that force, but of the ships and the men, the true hero of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary Wars against France. Wars that would see Britain crowned master of the seas. Ships relied on the wind, but also on human muscle power. Ships needed men, lots of men. In the peacetime Navy of the 1780s, there were around 14,000 sailors in the Navy. But by the time of Trafalgar, after years of intense warfare, there were 110,000 men. Now, where are all those men going to come from? From places like this. Fishing villages, ports, coastal cities, gangs of naval seamen roamed these streets. There were some volunteers, but infamously, a lot of men in Nelson's Navy were given no choice at all. They were dragged physically from pubs, from the street, on board ship to begin a career in the Navy. They were press ganged. Unlike the case of the Army, British law allowed the Navy to forcibly recruit. That's how important the Navy was seen as a national project. Technically, the law stated that they were supposed to only impress men between 18 and 55 who were used to being at sea, who were actually seafarers. But in practice, such was the need for extra hands on board that people with no experience at all could be gathered up in this net. They were called landsmen, and they were taken out to sea and forced to learn the ropes. But there were actual volunteers. There are descriptions of young men excited, entranced by the idea of going to sea and having adventures, and escaping the kind of rural drudgery or urban poverty of Georgian England. But there is no doubt at all that a huge number of men were forced to go to sea with little or no notice by the press gang system, and it caused terrible trauma for them, their families and their communities.
Just 30 miles to the east of London, tucked away on the River Medway, is the historic dockyard at Chatham. During the era of Nelson, this was the beating heart of the Royal Navy on land.
So once you'd volunteered or been impressed, you were thrust into the colourful, extraordinary, vast world of the Georgian Navy. You might be taken directly by ship to join a ship out at sea, or you might be brought through one of these huge naval dockyards like this one here at Chatham. And this is where you would have had a sense of the scale of the organisation that you had now been thrown into. Here you have giant storage houses, you have rope making buildings, you have sail lofts, you have great piles of timber everywhere to make the ships, hearts of oak, have our ships. You'd have seen ships being built along the waterfront here, further ships out at sea moored being completed or brought out of mothballing in preparation for a great war. This is where you would realise that the Navy was about so much more than just ships and fighting battles. It was a monumental industrial exercise, a gigantic expenditure of public money, this huge infrastructure, all directed towards making war at sea.
This dockyard's been used by the Navy since the middle of the 16th century. By the time of Nelson's Navy, it was right at the forefront of naval shipbuilding and cutting-edge industrial technology. At its height, over 10,000 people lived and worked here. It was an entire city geared towards making and maintaining ships. Its importance to Britain meant that it was a source of keen interest from the most powerful people in society, and the king was no exception.
When King George III visited this dockyard in the late 18th century for a royal visit to marvel at this cutting-edge, world-beating dockyard, he loved looking at the ships being built, storehouses, the great piles of timber that were prepared. But apparently, the climax of the visit was this building here. And you may be surprised to learn it's where they make the rope. So as I'm exploring the ropery, you come across great piles of wonderful rope like this. Perhaps this is destined for, who knows, maybe even HMS Victory or something. But this really shows what's going on here because there's a bit of an untangled bit at the end. So this is the yarn here. You might call it string, but no one would ever do that in this setting, but kind of string-like stuff. And that is all wound together to create a strand. All these yarn here making a strand. And then look, you can see the strand is also wound round here to make a rope, a big chunky rope. But the great thing about this cable is that the rope is then wound together up here to make a mighty cable, an ultra rope. Something you, for example, put the anchor on the end of and chuck it over the side.
The ropery here at Chatham is 1,100 feet long, but to get a real sense of its length, you need to get off 2 feet and on to 2 wheels.
The length of the ropery is the length mandated for ships' anchor cables. They had to have this much anchor cable on board so they can drop the anchor in a certain depth and be sure it would hold. And that is why this building is so enormously long. Longest building in Europe, we know, may well have been the longest building in the world at the time. Even by bike, it takes a couple of minutes to get from one end to the other. It is a gigantic building. We're talking about the 18th century here. We're talking about a time where there were no huge municipal buildings, no shopping centres or gigantic factories like this. They didn't exist anywhere else. This is the Royal Navy pioneering a new way of producing, of the industrial process. For me, this place, almost more than anything else, more than HMS Victory, this place emphasises the scale, the modernity, the industrial ambition of what the Navy was doing in the 18th century. Behind all Nelson's glorious victories and portraits of him standing on the quarterdeck, this is the reality of why Britannia ruled the waves, because Britain, over decades, has invested an unimaginable amount of money in creating the dock facilities, in creating the industrial facilities to build the most modern and technologically superior navy in human history to that point. The new recruit, whether volunteer or pressed man, would never have seen anything like this in civilian life. It would have left him in no doubt of the scale of the undertaking that he was now a small part of. But one thing you will not have seen on this site is any barracks, any accommodation. Because when you joined Nelson's Navy, you joined the ship. So with very little time elapsing, our new recruit would have been through this dockyard and out to join a ship at sea.
This is Phoenix, a 20th century ship, fitted out in a similar way to a ship in Nelson's Navy. She measures 112 foot long and 22 foot in the beam. That's her width to all you landsmen. That's about the same size as the ship that Captain Cook took on his voyage of exploration. And this will be our recruit's new home. Now, Phoenix is an impressive sight, but in comparison to Nelson's ships of the line, she's a baby. Not that it's a competition, but HMS Victory measures in at over 227 feet long and 52 in the beam. And where Phoenix is home to 10 sailors, Victory could take a complement of 850.
Hi Joel, how's it going?
Hi there. Good to see
Nice
you.
to meet
Welcome
you.
aboard Phoenix.
Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure.
So when men came aboard, a new draft of recruits came aboard, impressed men, volunteers, what would be the first thing that would happen? You have to sort of work out if they could sail, I guess, right?
Yeah, just the general assessment of their ability, but also their mental state, which comes into play when you're offshore.
So what are you looking for in new recruits? Which one of them have got some experience, I guess?
Just a drive and an ability to pull rope at the end of the day. For a deckhand, being able to pull a rope, ease a rope, get up the mast at any given hour is the most important quality in anyone at sea.
So say you're the first lieutenant, you'd be rating people useless, landsmen, ordinary seamen, so a bit of experience, able seamen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how would you judge? So I'm like, I know how to sail, but I'm obviously not familiar with your ship at all. Like, what would you ask me to work out whether I'm a...
Well, first is just your simple handling of lines and how you make things off on a belay pin.
Okay, so let's have a look.
we could have a test on this downhole here. So I'd take the line off here, and I'd just like to see how you handle that line, really. So if I gave you this and I told you to make it off.
Okay, so I would... Okay, I'll make it off, so I'll do that first.
Yeah.
Okay, figure of 8 round the belay pin.
That's it.
Okay, little coil. Nervous now, I won't get this wrong. But the thing is, I don't know what any of this rope is attached to. That's the problem.
Right. Yeah. So you're on the downhole there for the top mast staysail, main top mast staysail.
Right.
So just it's not a working line. That's good. So first thing I noticed was that you've clearly been on a ship before.
Okay.
We can tell that you've done your coil. First thing I noticed as well was that your fig eights were anti-clockwise, I believe.
Oh.
Instead of clockwise. So that'd be one of the things that I'd spot, but easy enough to correct. And then your coil's not too bad as well. Bit of a lead there, but generally most of your coils are the same length, and we're coiled clockwise as well. So yeah, so it's a good sign.
I feel like I'm heading for ordinary seaman rather than able seaman though.
Probably, yeah, just to sharpen up a few of the skills.
Once our recruit had been rated, they would quickly learn that their entire purpose was to keep the ship moving, handling the lines, managing the sails. Everything was done to serve the ship. And it would be on-the-job training. They would be expected to get to grips with everything and fast.
If you're a deckhand, you need to be able to do everything.
Okay.
If someone's injured, someone becomes ill, everyone needs to have the skills. So
You need to learn the ropes.
Absolutely, yeah. So even if it's a case of when we had greener crew members, you have to get them up. They don't know what they're doing, and you have to talk them through it, and it's pretty miserable for them because it's windy and it's cold, and you're stood on one bit of rope and it's not pleasant, but you've got to expose them to it.
As well as learning the ropes, our recruit would have to learn the rhythms of life on board one of His Britannic Majesty's ships. Life that started pretty early.
At 5 a.m. came the piercing scream of the bosun's whistles. These tough characters moved through the ship, telling everyone that it was time to get up. All hands up, ahoy! Then they came along with their knives and shouted, out or down, that's the word. And if you're still in your hammock, they'd cut the rope here and send you crashing to the deck. You're expected to stow your hammock, take it up to the deck and place it in the netting that surrounded the rails of the ship. And then it was time to give the ship a good clean. Every single day, the ship's routine started with a thorough clean. Cleanliness was next to godliness in the Royal Navy of Nelson's time. In fact, Napoleon found himself a prisoner of the Royal Navy in 1815 after the Battle of Waterloo, and he commented, as did many, many foreign visitors, on how British ships were spotless. So the entire crew would have set to work scrubbing, brushing, swabbing the decks every single morning. There would have been a lot on those decks. The pitch and tar would have come off the rig. The animals that were kept aboard for fresh produce would have had their droppings all over the ship. And of course there were hundreds of men living aboard, so they needed a good scrub. And that was one of the ways in which the Royal Navy kept incidents of disease in these tightly packed communities down. so they would have washed the decks down. Then they used these holy stones, basically bits of sandstone. And sort of sand the deck down, take a top layer of muck off it, and then you get your brushes or your swabs made of old rope, wash that over the side. Looking very clean, that stretch of deck now, if you don't mind me saying.
After a hard morning of swabbing, our recruit would have earned themselves a spot of breakfast.
Now, contrary to the myth, sailors in Nelson's Navy actually ate pretty well. The Navy looked after its seamen. They had to, because they had to have the strength and the morale to sail and fight these enormous ships, particularly given the diet in the Georgian slums at the time. Sailors would have been very excited to have meat 4 days a week. On Saturdays, they had this, 2 pounds of salt beef. Now this looks slightly more appetizing than it would have looked back in the early 19th century. There the beef would have been packed into casks, perhaps for years on end, covered in salt to preserve it, and be so hard it was almost said to be like a piece of wood that you could varnish. Still, what a treat. You'd eat that alongside the carbohydrates, the famous ship's biscuits. These are baked hard in special naval facilities around Britain. They too could be packed in casks and transported over huge distances before they just fell apart. Even so, there are some legendary stories about just how hard and disgusting these got. The ship's cook cooked for the men, the ordinary and able seamen. The officers had their own cooks, their own supplies. They ate very well, thank you, back there at the stern of the ship. He'd take a great big vat, he'd pour in some meat, he'd pour in old bits of biscuit, and he'd create these kind of stews. There was a weird sort of slush that rose to the surface that he could skim off and do with it what he will. It was a perk of the job. You could sell them to rope makers, for example, to make them more resistant to wind and weather. The cook benefited from what was known as the slush fund. So this was on high days and holidays, but 3 days a week, it was no meat for you. Instead it was oatmeal, about half a pint of peas, and then equally dispersed amount of cheese, butter and sugar. It's said by modern nutritionists that the naval diet of the Georgian Navy gave seafarers about 5,000 calories a day, which is what you'd expect for young men doing a huge amount of heavy lifting. And all of that, of course, had to be washed down with something. Beer. Now again, the myth here is that the Navy drank nothing but grog, rum mixed with water and a bit of lemon juice. But in fact, beer was the staple drink. It wasn't the kind of full-strength beer we get nowadays. It's thought to be a little bit weaker, small beer. But they had a gallon a day. Now that wasn't quite as insane as it sounds, because our beer was probably better for you than most drinking water, which could have been pulled out of the Thames or somewhere like that. The brewing process meant that many of the microbes, many of the nasty diseases were killed off. And so beer stored in casks might keep the crew healthier than drinking water. Of course, when the beer ran out, that's when you had to turn to the local tipple. If your ship was serving in the Mediterranean, you might take arak or wine, which needed a lot of watering down. If you were in the Caribbean, well, you're near the sugar plantations, and that meant rum, the famous grog. That was about 4 parts water to 1 part rum, lemon juice added to keep the scurvy away, and a bit of brown sugar as well. It should be said, predictably, that sailors were world-leading experts in smuggling their own supplies of booze aboard ship. Captains would supplement this basic diet wherever they could. They knew that a well-fed crew was likely to be a happy and effective crew. Nelson's letters are full of accounts of him trying to find decent food, drinks, water for his men, keep their health in good shape. And that meant captains started experimenting in the 18th century and early 19th, particularly when it came to scurvy, a disease they didn't quite realise caused by deficiency of vitamin C that led to complete debilitation and death. One way of dealing with scurvy was very unpopular. Sauerkraut, kept a long time, full of vitamin C, a superfood. A little more popular, the lemon, replaced by limes later in the 19th century, but a very reliable way of keeping scurvy at bay. The Admiralty declared that when it came to food and drink, the sailors should be given the best of everything. And I think it would be quite a stretch to claim this was the best that Georgian Britain could offer. But certainly, compared to their peers on land or in other industries, the sailors of Nelson's Navy were pretty well looked after.
But it wasn't all plain sailing in Nelson's Navy. After all, this was Britain's primary military instrument. And after breakfast, some sailors would get a keen reminder of that.
By 11 o'clock in the morning, the ship's company was fed, the ship was clean and jobs were underway. But at that time, the ship was often called to witness punishment. Now, punishment in the Royal Navy is a thing of legend. And some ship's captains were particularly brutal. Others weren't and didn't allow, for example, flogging on their ships. But there were a range of punishments, starting at, for example, stopping your beer ration, your grog ration. But there was also starting, just little balls of rope which bosuns would administer liberally. But flogging was the most serious punishment that a captain of a ship could administer on his own authority. That meant that the ship's company would gather here, a man would be tied to a grating, the Marines would line up, an officer in full dress uniform would read out the Articles of War, the rules by which the Navy governed its ships, and a man might be given 12 lashes. Any more than that, and you were supposed to go through a court-martial process and get permission from an admiral and other captains assembled. The system was certainly brutal by our standards today, and at the time there was a powerful reform movement within Britain, and in fact starting, so kind of indiscriminate hitting and running the gauntlet, which is when you were beaten up basically by the whole crew for something like stealing. They were both outlawed by the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Also, there's a huge difference within the fleet how severe captains chose to beat their crews. Some captains were famous floggers, others refused to flog their men. So the mythology of a navy in which unwilling sailors were governed by their terror of the lash isn't entirely accurate.
Whilst keeping the ship sailing was an important day-to-day task for our recruit, he would also need to keep in mind this was a fighting vessel, and he would, when needed, be thrown into the chaos of battle. To ensure he had a fighting chance, weapons practice would be the order of the day. I'm being joined on board by Keith Wallace, who can show me the kind of weapons our recruit would have got to grips with.
We've got our sea service flintlock pistol,
Look at that.
which is in use from mid-18th century right up to this point and through later into the 19th century as well.
Wow.
And then, so this is our 12-inch barrel. There's later on, 1790s, they start to make a 9-inch barrel because they're realizing that in the tight press of people that you need that shorter barrel because it's just a bit more cumbersome otherwise. But you've got a mix of the 12 and the 9-inch being used at battles like Trafalgar. Traditionally, the practice is that you, as you're boarding, you draw your pistol and you fire as you're boarding. But that's sort of been in debate because there's a chap who suggests that actually it's better to draw your cutlass first.
Yeah.
Once you're at a closer range when it can be more accurate, then you draw, and with your left hand, you actually fire, and you've got a better chance of hitting your target rather than trying to do it while you're boarding.
And the principle behind this is exactly the same as muskets, isn't it, with the longer barrels? So how does it fire?
So basically, by this point, you've got cartridges. So you're going to bite off the top of your paper cartridge. You're entering the powder into here.
So gunpowder goes into that little pan there.
That's it, packing that down, and then you close the frizzen.
So when that powder explodes, it creates a kind of explosion. It sends a flame into the barrel that ignites the main charge.
Exactly, yeah. So you've got your powder, your
Yeah.
ball in here, and then, of course, you're ramming that down.
Okay, let's try and ram
It might be a
this
bit stiff. There we go.
There we go.
So then we can ram that down, packing that all down because it's a slightly undersized ball, but that wadding effectively that you get from the cartridge is going to keep that in. It's going to keep that ball
Okay,
from rolling
yeah,
out.
lovely.
So then you're at half cock, and then you can bring that back to full cock, and then that's when you fire.
And the flint creates a spark on there. Is that and that ignites the powder in there?
Effectively, yeah. So that's what's happening here.
So it's quite slow to reload. How many shots can you get off every minute or every 5 minutes?
I mean, I think that the idea is basically this is a single shot weapon in this instance. So you've preloaded presumably just before you're boarding, then you've got it ready to fire. But then this is where the idea of having this sort of brace of pistols, that you've got one, but then, you know, particularly if we think back to the sort of the golden age of piracy, we've got this idea of a brace of pistols, and that is because you've got this really as a single shot weapon, but then it does become useful either as a clubbing weapon or for blocking and deflecting attacks as well.
But to get a real sense of what it would be like to fight with one of these pistols, I'm going to have a go at firing one myself.
So as the enemy ship comes alongside, you cock it, don't want to go off half cock, wait for them to get nice and close, and then whoa! That is incredible, that's really loud. And you get that extraordinary smell of gunpowder, unmistakable smell of gunpowder. The battlefield would have reeked of that from the cannon, from the pistols and muskets. It's quite a kick as well. It might look like a primitive weapon to us today, but this was very capable of sending a bullet straight into someone and causing a lot of damage. But that's not the only weapon they had.
No, not at all. So we've got a range of different cutlasses that we can use as well. And so we have a range here. I think when most people think of a cutlass, they'll think of your classic pirate sword.
Yeah.
This is a slightly earlier sword, Dutch East India type, and it's got this shell guard. You can see this big curve to the blade. And watch that, there's quite a sharp point on that one as well.
God.
But this is the classic kind of curved blade, essentially like a hanger or a short saber that people will think of when they think of a cutlass. This is a little bit earlier, but there might have still been a few of these types knocking around, more among the officer classes. Your standard issue at this time is going to be the 1804 Navy cutlass, which you see has a straight blade. It's got this figure of 8.
Bit more workman like this.
Yes, it's much more of a tool that really does do the job. Again, it's great for cutting, it's great for thrusting as well. Although it's quite weighty, it weighs about a kilogram, most of that weight is towards the hand, so it doesn't feel too cumbersome. It feels like you can manoeuvre it around quite well. When you're in these tight presses, and we get the sense that they often are in these tight presses where there's not a huge amount of room to swing a sword around. A lot of cuts seem to have been either down at the head, or of course, if you're thrusting, if you're that close in as well.
So yeah, there's the artillery drill that goes on these ships, but there's also the melee. There's the hand-to-hand fighting as well.
Absolutely, and I don't think it gets spoken about enough in terms of once you're boarding, you're really down to tools like this and whatever's to hand as well.
A lot of times, I guess you'd surrender when your ship was battered by artillery fire, but you think about the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, Nelson captured ships through boarding, so it did happen.
It did happen, yeah. There are lots of instances of people striking their colours before it gets to being boarded. We do know that people were boarding and being boarded, and we do know that these skirmishes took place, and they were brutal and they were bloody as well.
But even more important than the training was keeping the ship moving in the right direction.
Right, this is where the ship steered from, is it?
Yes, we've brought you up to the poop deck here, and the helm, which is where the majority of the crew spend a great deal of time on watch and keeping a good course. Probably one of the most, if not the most important part of the job.
So you're steering by the compass?
Yeah, compass binnacle.
And I mean, navigation would have been a huge challenge in those days, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yes and no. I think it would have been a challenge in the weather that they were in. But the individuals that were on these ships were incredibly well trained, and this was all they did. The captain would make a course. I'd expect crew to follow within 5 or 10 degrees of that. 5 being the preferred. It depends what kind of weather we're in. If we're sailing to the wind.
And then you, as first mate of this ship, you like Nelson's Navy, you still sleep right here in the stern, so you're ready to burst on deck and be where the action is.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's just as important now as it was, hundreds of years ago. The crew sleep in the accommodation further forward, and both myself and the skipper sleep back aft here. We're seconds away from being on the helm ourselves, so as soon as, usually we hear it. If something goes wrong, you can hear it. You hear blocks hit the deck, you'll hear people running, and before people shout, you're dressed, boots on deck, what's going on.
Like the officers coming out of the officers' accommodation, I guess, and then also from the stern, you've got a really good sense of the entire ship. You can see what's going on.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's the most stable part of the vessel as well when you're in a bit of a sea state. It's a good place to get a good feel for what's going on. Keeping a good course though for the crew's tremendously important. as if they're 20, 30 degrees off and they're constantly snaking through the course. You can add, 10, 20, 30 miles onto your course.
But there's much more to sailing than just keeping a hand on the wheel. The sails themselves need constant attention, and that often means climbing the rigging.
Right, well, we're up here now on the main fighting top. It feels pretty high already. It's a bit windy. You can really feel the wind in the rigging. But can you imagine coming up here when the ship is just pitching and in the big waves? It must be pretty intense, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. When we are at sea, particularly in a moderate sea state, you have to take breaks while you're climbing because you're hanging over the sea.
Yeah,
so hang on.
And then absolutely knackered.
Yeah.
Right, I'm stepping on. So now we have to go out on this spar to make sail, right?
That's it.
Okay, this is the tricky bit. I said I was stepping on, but hold on.
Yeah, that's it. That's the ticket.
There we go.
It's tremendously uncomfortable, but that's the job, unfortunately.
There we go. Right.
And we find the more people we have on the yards, the tighter this gets and the less legroom you have.
Okay, so now why do we have to come out on these yards?
So you come out on the yards to stow them, to stow the sail or repair the sail, depending on how bad it is. You can see just next to your arm here, to your right arm, you've got a gasket around the sail here.
Oh yeah, there, yeah.
And that's to keep the sail in place when we're not using it.
Okay, so in a big storm, when the wind starts blowing, you'll come up here, gather all the sail up and store it on this yard arm.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
We can control the sail when we're trying to stow it with two other lines, which are the clews and the bunts. We pull those up from deck. That depowers the sail, and then we ease the halyard down, so bring this yard right the way down. And then from there, the rest is you have to come up the mast and stow it by hand.
So you've really got to know what you're doing up here, and I mean, it would be easy. I mean, the ship would be, you'd be going through quite an angle if the ship was really moving over a big sea, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, and that only gets worse the higher up you go. From deck, it's barely noticeable. Up here, you notice, and then up at the gallants, it's not a pleasant experience at all, really.
And those ships we've had even taller masts back in the day.
Absolutely, yeah, we're small in comparison.
Oh my goodness, crazy. Well, should we keep going up?
Certainly, yeah, by all means.
Right.
From the top of the mast, the view is breathtaking.
It's one of the most remarkable things I've ever done is climb the rigging of a tall ship. And to think that you're following in the footsteps of those young men, the top men, who are in charge of sailing this ship, it's climbing up not just in harbour like me, but in the middle of storms, battles, cannonballs flying past their ears. And their job up here was essential. Well, this was the engine room of those ships. The sails propelled the ship through the water. And without these sails being set properly, the whole ship's company would be in terrible danger.
After an exhausting day, cleaning, training and working the sails, it would finally be the time for rest.
At 8 p.m. it was time to pipe down. One watch was sent below. They rigged up their hammocks. They each had about 14 inches of space, but actually that's 28 inches because one half of the crew was always up on deck. They rigged their hammocks. Lanterns went off, and it was supposed to be lights out for a 4-hour sleep.
But for some, the hammock would have to wait.
Around half the crew had to be on deck at any one time. It was relentless. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. And the crew up here had to man these sails. They had to keep a watch out for navigational hazards or enemy ships. They had to steer, do all the things that kept this complex vessel moving through the water safely. If they did spot something they didn't like or the weather changed dramatically, the crew below decks would be woken up and it would be all hands to their stations. You didn't get an unbroken night's sleep in Nelson's Navy.
But with luck, all the sailors would get at least some shut-eye, ready to be awoken at 5 a.m. for another day.
The primary purpose of Nelson's ships was to wage battle. Sooner or later, these crews would experience the thrill and the horror of war at sea. But usually these ships were not set up to fight, they were set up to sail. So as soon as an enemy fleet was sighted, an enemy ship, the call went out, clear the ship for action. And that meant these gun ports were lifted, the cannon were run out. It meant that internal partitions were taken away, so the entire ship was just one huge floating artillery platform. Furniture, anything getting in the way, perhaps animals, even livestock carried on board, would be loaded into small boats and towed behind the ship. As the captain stood here on his quarterdeck, his ship cleared fore and aft for action, he would have known that this vessel had been transformed really from a mode of transport into a weapon of war.
And the most powerful weapon in Nelson's navy is the cannon. Sadly, we can't fire a cannon on board the ship, so I've come to a firing range in Dorset where we can. With me is artillery expert Nick Hall.
Right, so this is obviously a naval gun, this one here.
Yes, it's a 12-pounder,
Right.
of which there were a large number at the Battle of Trafalgar.
But 12 pounds, it looks enormous. It's not even one of the bigger guns on board ship like HMS Victory, is it?
It's an upper deck gun,
Wow.
so
It's a baby gun.
Yes, but it's a very good compromise, if you like, between the weight of the gun, the heaviness of the drill, and the hit on the target. So it's still quite powerful, but it's not got the massive weight of, say, the 32-pounders on the main deck. By the time of the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, English gun making was at a very high level. Cast iron or bronze, some of the earlier guns were bronze, is not actually got all that much tensile strength, but clever design and very great craft skills could ensure that you could get a gun that was very unlikely to burst. I've gone through a lot of records and I can't find much record of these English guns bursting.
And a bursting gun on a crowded gun deck, unimaginable carnage.
Yeah. A lot of people would be killed and maimed.
Let's load one. You can teach me all about that process.
Yes.
Alex and Nat, let's get you in here. Come on.
A gun like this in battle would have a very large crew because you've got people bringing up the ammunition.
Of course.
And some for speed. You might be passing me the shot, for example, whereas for something like this, you don't need so many people.
All right, so worming it out there.
That is worming, and it was realised in the Navy that you had to worm every round.
And that's just to getting the junk out of the barrel.
Yeah, because they were using a cloth cartridge, and most of it burnt, but the base of the cartridge tended to stick against the breech face.
And then so we've just had we've swabbed it. So any bits of sparks, any awkward
Yes, I mean
remnants.
The sponging is vital once you've started firing because of exactly as you say, for remnants of mouldering gunpowder. And gunpowder is it's a very dirty explosive.
Come on, powder monkey.
Yeah, that's right. And the youngest one at Trafalgar was only 10.
10 years old.
Because
Because the gunpowder has to be stored far away from where the action is, deep in the bowels of the ship.
below
right?
the waterline.
Yeah. Here we're pricking it now.
So that's piercing the cartridge.
So opening up the gunpowder bag, isn't
Yeah,
it? Yeah.
to make sure that the ignition takes place
Right,
reliably.
and now priming it with a bit of gunpowder on top.
Yeah, which should go down the vent.
There's now a kind of gunpowder bridge between this little mound here down into the cannon through that hole to the big gunpowder charge below.
Yeah, a single spark is enough.
Crikey.
What I need you to do is stand roughly about here, holding the linstock. You want the match to be vertical, like that.
Give it a bit of a blow.
Yeah, blow on your coals.
Lovely.
And then just drop that straight into the powder. And as soon as it takes, lift the linstock up out of the way.
All right, get your ear protection, everyone. Okay. Fire, she bears.
Firing!
Whoa! You can feel that it's the sound, but the shockwave really hits you as well. And look at the grass in front. Wow,
The fog of war.
woo, that was intense. And imagine that in an enclosed gun deck as well, with the beams low over your head. That would be amplified, wouldn't it?
It really would.
Wow.
It really would.
That was exciting enough, but for the next shot we're going to fire a full-sized cannonball. And we have a target, not a ship, but planks of thick oak, which we've set up about 70 metres away.
It's a very authentic range, as you're
Yeah.
suggesting. I mean, the British fleet held their fire.
Have a care. Firing. 3, 2, 1. Give fire.
Crikey. Woohoo!
Slowed down, you can see the cannonball emerging from the smoke. But did it hit the target?
Oh yeah, right above the right-hand top side of the X. Look at that, I can see the trees beyond it. Right, we go and take a look at the damage.
Can we?
This is going to be great.
That's very nice.
And that's a decent chunk of oak there, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Goodness
Yes.
me. Irreparable hole, that. You could bang a plug into it,
Yes.
I suppose. Oh, look at this splintering.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, there you are. So that's the perfect textbook example.
Textbook.
Because you're not trying to sink a ship. I mean, it's very difficult to sink a timber warship.
Yeah.
So you're firing above the waterline to damage the crew.
I mean, that would kill someone easily, wouldn't it? It's razor sharp. It's scything through the air, almost supersonic speed.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
For a crowded gun deck.
Nat stood by the furthest splinter.
Oh wow.
So that's how far, that's the range that the splinters flew.
Which is 30 metres, 20 metres, 30 metres. And you're talking about a crowded gun deck,
Yeah.
hundreds of people in there. And you're
And-
talking
and-
about
and-
many cannonballs
Yeah.
simultaneously.
And you're right about the scything. If you look at slow motion, I think we'll find that they are rotating.
The slow motion cameras show just how many lethal splinters there are.
I mean, there's dozens of splinters all over here, spread over a really big area. There are a few places in the world I would like to be less than a gun deck at Trafalgar with people firing at point blank
Yes.
range.
Isn't it amazing that,
Terrifying.
that men did it?
And yet, enemy cannon fire wasn't even the worst danger the sailors faced.
A huge number of the men who went to sea in Nelson's Navy never returned. They died on active service, but the vast majority of those were not killed in battle. 50% of the casualties during the Great Wars against France and Spain 200 years ago were through disease. Another 30% down to accidents. Only less than 10% ended up killed in battle. Some of them were scooped overboard. Others, like this gentleman here, would be wrapped up at the end of the battle in an old bit of sailcloth or a hammock, stitched up like this. There you go, last stitch through the nose by tradition to make sure this was not just a reluctant deserter, but someone who was actually dead. Then a prayer was read out and the corpse would be tossed in to Davy Jones's locker. Life on these ships was no picnic, but I'm not sure it was the brutal servitude that it sometimes made out to be. The men fought superbly. They sailed these ships with such professionalism, and they, in doing so, won a series of stunning victories against the forces of Napoleon. Nelson and some other glamorous admirals sometimes get the credit, but I believe the credit should go to the men who sailed these ships, and not just them, but the people of the dockyards who made them and refitted them, and even the bureaucrats who did the unglamorous yet essential work of investing of making sure these ships and men had the food and supplies they needed to win. Altogether, that entire package made Britain's Navy the most potent force in the history of maritime warfare.